March 29th, 1461, Palm Sunday. 50,000 men are packed onto a plateau, swinging poleaxes and warhammers in a blinding, sub-zero whiteout. Men slip in blood hidden by fresh drifts, crushing each other in a 10-hour melee. The Wars of the Roses label is a Tudor-era construction that sanitizes the conflict into a romanticized dynastic pageant. Physical evidence from the battlefields reveals the true output, a mechanical, unheroic slaughter. This conflict was a catastrophic failure of a highly centralized state architecture. England's government system broke down entirely, unable to manage competing factions or enforce the law. That structural collapse began with a singular event, the sudden and total executive paralysis of the ruling monarch, King Henry VI. Without a functioning head of state to arbitrate disputes, the nobility recognized a power vacuum. They capitalized on it by privatizing military force. Regional lords mutated into heavily armed rogue shareholders. They built corporate-style mercenary networks, replacing traditional feudal land obligations with cold, hard cash. Take a paralyzed executive branch and introduce outsourced, privatized mega-armies. The intersection of those two variables guarantees conflict on an industrial scale. To understand how a European superpower lost its monopoly on violence in a single generation, we have to discard the romantic drama. We must analyze this era through the strict lens of political science and logistics. In 15th century England, the government operated as a personal monarchy. The state apparatus had no independent momentum. It functioned solely through the active will and direct arbitration of the king. In August 1453, news reached London that the English army had been annihilated at the Battle of Castillon, ending the 100 Years' War. Upon hearing this, Henry VI suffered a complete mental breakdown. Records describe him falling into a weak state, where for a year and a half he had neither sense nor reason. He became completely unresponsive, failing even to react to the birth of his own son. The immediate political consequence was an instant paralysis of the executive branch. Parliament and the courts relied entirely on royal assent. Without a conscious king, the government was constitutionally unable to function or process basic administrative commands. This executive vacuum forced Queen Margaret of Anjou to abandon her traditional royal roles. She stepped into the void, attempting to operate the country as a proxy CEO. Her objective was a hostile restructuring, to salvage the bankrupt state and isolate ambitious, rogue shareholders. Her main target was Richard, Duke of York, a wealthy magnate who had positioned himself as Lord Protector during Henry's illness. In May 1455, Margaret and the recovered Henry called a great council, deliberately excluding the Yorkist faction. Fearing arrest, York intercepted the royal party at St. Albans with an armed force, igniting the initial civil conflict. Margaret faced extreme structural friction. She was attempting to assert centralized authority and command obedience without the underlying, undeniable mandate of an active, capable monarch. A personality-driven government architecture requires a functional personality at its center. Without a capable executive, the system mathematically collapses into civil war. The nobility were able to challenge the crown because of a shift in the English economic structure. The old model of strictly granting land in exchange for military loyalty had degraded into a highly transactional system known to historians as bastard feudalism. This diagram illustrates the new hierarchy. Instead of allegiance to the king through land titles, retainers formed affinities. Wealth flowed downward from a central magnate to knights, entirely bypassing the crown.
These legal indentures replaced land obligations with cash for military service. The labor pool fueling these contracts was vast. England was flooded with massive numbers of experienced, unemployed veterans returning from the end of the 100 Years' War, all seeking steady pay. Magnates utilized livery and maintenance, a form of medieval corporate branding. Retainers wore their lord's heraldic badge, like Richard of York's White Rose, visually identifying and legally protecting these private mercenary networks from local courts. In this new economy, political reach became a function of liquidity. A lord's leverage was measured by the volume of hard currency he could distribute to keep his affinity operational. The central government was heavily in debt. The Crown's own bankruptcy prevented it from competing with the private sector's ability to pay troops. effectively transferring the state's monopoly on violence to the nobility. Magnates like Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, used their wealth to raise massive private retinues that functioned as standing armies, dwarfing any force the catatonic king could muster. By allowing wealth to directly purchase military power, bastard feudalism exposed a fatal structural flaw. When the executive branch failed, the nobility already possessed the corporate hardware necessary to tear the state apart. The confrontation at Towton on Palm Sunday, 1461, was the inevitable, catastrophic collision of privatized mega-armies. Chivalric glory had no place in this mechanical output of a failing system. The scale of the engagement was staggering for the 15th century. Between 50 and 65,000 soldiers were deployed simultaneously, representing roughly 2% of the entire English population. This topographical map shows how geography dictated the slaughter. Both armies deployed across a restrictive width bordered by marshes and cock-beck, forcing a head-on collision. Then, severe winds drove a blinding snowstorm horizontally directly into the northern Lancastrian positions. The immediate tactical consequence was severe. The Lancastrian archers were blinded by the snow. They misjudged their range and fired all their ammunition short, leaving a thick carpet of arrows in the ground in front of the Yorkist lines. The Yorkists employed a ruthless counter-tactic. They loosed a single volley into the wind, stepped back out of range to let the Lancastrians exhaust their supply, and then advanced to collect and return the enemy's own spent arrows. Exhausting their projectiles, the armies clashed. What followed was a grueling 10-hour melee, characterized by suffocating, zero-visibility hand-to-hand combat. Advanced metallurgy had negated the use of standard projectiles at close range. Heavy, overlapping steel plate armor forced men into highly physical close-quarters attrition, requiring specialized bludgeoning and piercing weapons to crack joints and split bone. Modern archaeological evidence discovered in 1996 at a construction site in Towton validates the scale of the violence and industrial nature of the slaughter. The pathology of the exhumed combatants reveals deep horizontal cuts across the backs of heads and skulls, entirely bisected by bladed weapons. The remains show severe, repetitive post-mortem mutilations, indicating frenzy and mass exhaustion. These mass graves serve as a permanent physical record. They entirely refute the myth of a civilized or chivalric civil war. Towton was the mechanical terminus of a state that abandoned executive function and privatized its violence. When a system collapses at the top, it is the population that pays the ultimate price in the snow.